Hi, and welcome to Artalaap, South Asia's first independent visual culture podcast with me, Kamayani. Today, we have with us artist Pritika Chowdhry. Her solo exhibition, Unbearable Memories, Unspeakable Histories, is on view at Chicago's South Asia Institute till the 10th of December. This forbidding title is a reference to the South Asian Partition, which in 1947 led to the creation of India and Pakistan as independent nation-states. Both countries celebrate 75 years of freedom from British rule this week on the 14th and 15th of August. This Artalaap episode is dedicated to an event which seems at once meaningful, but given the current state of affairs, at least in India, also devoid of much cause for joy. Now, as many of you probably know, there's an established, well-theorized canon of South Asian art that confronts the partition right from the 1940s to the present day. Just listing all the artists might take up the entire episode. Pritika's work belongs to this tradition. It draws on trauma studies and feminist historical methods, as well as dramatic, unique materials and assemblages to memorialize the partition through a mode of art making that's called the anti-memorial. Let me introduce you to our guest. Pritika Chowdhry is an artist, curator, and writer. Her works have been exhibited at the Weisman Museum in Minneapolis, the Queens Museum in New York, the Hunterdon Museum in New Jersey, the Islip Art Museum in Long Island, the Visual Arts Center in New Jersey, the DoVA Temporary at the University of Chicago, the Brodsky Center at Rutgers University, and the Cambridge Art Gallery in Massachusetts. She is the recipient of the Vilas International Travel Fellowship, an Edith and Sinaiko Frank Fellowship for a Woman in the Arts, a Wisconsin Arts Board grant, and a Minnesota State Arts Board grant. Pritika has presented her studio research projects at various conferences, such as the International Arts Symposium at NYU, the Contested Terrains of Globalization at UC-Irvine, and the South Asian Conference at UW-Madison. So I first saw Pritika's work online, on social media, since she's shown mainly in the United States, and I haven't been to the United States, and therefore haven't had the chance to view her work in person. But since my last episode with the artist Arshi Ahmadzai was also on this idea, also kind of dealt with this idea of the Naguftaha or the unspoken. I thought I'd begin this season as well by picking up that thread of representing that which is not in fact representable. Before we continue, I'd like to let our listeners know how to access the material accompanying our conversation. To view the images and other material being referenced and discussed in the episode, click on the link in the show notes to access the guide. You can also find the link to the guide for each episode in our Instagram captions and tweets. Hi Pritika, thank you so much for joining us on Artalaap. It's so great to have you with us.
Oh, thank you, Kamayani. Thank you. It is so wonderful to be on here with you.
I'm really glad that we're getting a chance to do this interview on the occasions of the Independence Days of India and Pakistan. And I think, because your practice invests so much in that event, I thought it'd be great to kind of have you on and talk about the various ways in which one can envision and revisit this traumatic event that also, is something that we carry with us in the subcontinent. You grew up in India and then, you formally trained as an artist in the States at Wisconsin-Madison, right? So you've had the experience of both sort of immersion and distance, right? Like from the South Asian community.
This is true. This is exactly true.
So tell us how you arrived at the partition as one of the focuses of your artistic practice. When did you make the first work that's part of this particular project?
Yes. Okay. That's a great start. So the first work that I made about the partition was in 2007. And that work was called Queering Mother India.
Right.
And it was part of this sort of amalgam, mentally and emotionally of the 2002 Gujarat pogrom, the Godhra riots, and surprisingly 9/11, where in both events, in 2001 and 2002, I saw how Muslims were being targeted. In 2002, the Muslims in India, and in 2001, and then subsequently the war on terror in 2003 that started. So 2001, 2002, 2003, the Muslims in the Middle East. And I realized the parallels between certain things that India does as a regional superpower and certain things that America does as a global superpower, and how those events sort of affect and impact the Muslim minorities. This Muslim subaltern. So
right. And I mean, let's talk about Queering Mother India, because it was the first work that you did, right? That's part of this project.
Yes.
So it features this kind of the dismembering of women's bodies.
That's right.
I'm curious to know, like, why you use the word queering. Like, what did you mean to sort of suggest by using that?
That's a great question. Thank you. So, at that time, I was deeply reading and studying Gayatri Gopinath's text on queer diasporas and how bodies become queered. Certain bodies become queered. The heteronormative body, it is this idealized version, right? It is able-bodied. It is it desires the opposite gender at all times, and in the case of females, in the case of women, the ideal body also, is a virgin till she gets married, is never raped, never violated. That never happens to the ideal female body, right? So there are all these like unspoken, so to speak, criteria that a body must meet in order to be considered a legitimate body, a valued body, so to say. And I think in her text, Gopinath really poetically sort of unpacks and sort of exposes all these sort of invisible, unspoken, just sort of internalized criteria that we all intuitively know. We know when we are outside the norm, So a woman that has been, for example, raped, knows that she's outside of that paradigm. She can never be, now a body that is considered normal, valued. She's always going to be damaged goods. And this was something that I also saw in the feminist historiography by Urvashi Bhattalia, that in the name of this patriarchal ideal, which actually so few women can actually meet, this was then harnessed as a weapon in the partition riots and the communal riots. And we all saw this in 2002 in the Gujarat pogrom. That was definitely something that the Hindu right deployed. They deployed it very intentionally as a weapon. The Muslim woman, of course, is, no matter how much she conforms to those criteria, is always outside of that canon, right? She can never be part of that canon because she's Muslim. So I wanted to explore all the ways in which bodies do get queered, rather than just the one literal definition. And then it occurred to me that because the Mother India construct, this patriarchal construct, in its perverse logic, kind of enables the use of the harnessing of rape as a weapon. That should be really the thing to focus on in this project of queered bodies due to violence, due to sexual violence. So hence the title, Queering Mother India. And then the subtitle, of course, is one of Butali's chapters or sections, History is a Woman's Body. So I'm definitely pointing to that. I'm alluding to that sort of queering,
Sure, yeah. And I think, very broadly speaking, there are, of course, many nuanced definitions of queering, but I think one thing they do agree on is there is a consensus that it is a form or mode of being that stands in opposition to heterosexuality and patriarchy, what are termed heteronormative values that dominate our lives.
Exactly.
So in that sense, yes, thank you for your explanation of why you arrived at this particular term to discuss the ravaged and savaged bodies of women that litter, of course, not just the history of the South Asian Partition, but events of violence around the world. And I think it's also interesting because, people like as Butalia has discussed, and also the scholar Veena Das has talked about
That's right.
the way in which the state constitutes itself as a masculine heteropatriarchal body is by becoming the regulator and custodian of women's bodies. And in fact, in Veena Das's book, she talks about how the abducted woman, who is the ultimate figure of gendered violence in the discourse on partition, it is the retrieval of their bodies becomes the very basis on which the state's masculinity can be constructed in almost like in homology to the masculinity of families, to the patriarchy of families, in which the male, head of the family has to protect the bodies of the women in the ambit of his control.
Yes.
So that's really interesting to also think about queering as something that is fundamentally in opposition to this construction. And of course, as we know, in all fundamentalist and right-wing rhetoric, the bodies of trans persons, the bodies of the non-heterosexual people are, as you said, devalued entirely. And so this project, did you begin it at university during your studies?
Yes. So I was doing my MFA at UW-Madison, and I happened to attend, luckily, a graduate seminar on cultural memory. And it, in the readings of that, and of course, being in the West, cultural memory is very much focused on Holocaust and, a few other events. But, and at that time, there was some conversation about 9/11, but, 9/11 was still recent, in 2006 when I attended. But the discourse was emerging definitely around the cultural memory of 9/11 too. So so this was my sort of odd location in a graduate school in US, right? That I felt that South Asia or my cultural context was obviously not represented, and especially back then. I was like the only, South Asian in my graduate program, and it's a big graduate program. At any one given point, there are like at least 100 students there, because it's a 3-year program. It's intense, and it's a huge, top 10 university. It's just one of those things. So here I was, before making Queering Mother India work, I had actually made like a life-size clay sculpture wearing a sari. Sari folds also I had like sculpted in clay. Then I had painted it, and all of this stuff. And the woman in the sculpture was bald. She had a black eye, and she was sticking her tongue out like that. And that was like, so when we were invited to as first semester grad students, we were invited to put one work in as an introduction to the program. That was the work I had introduced myself with. And my professors were like, they just didn't even know what to do with me, because they're like, maybe you should, look into making more universal works. And in my mind, I'm thinking, as that, I'm not doing this. As it is, there is minimal representation, and then I should remove the representation that I can bring. No, I'm not doing that. So I, of course, stubbornly continued to make works in my South Asian cultural specific context. And then post the grad seminar, it sort of gave me, I guess, a vocabulary to assert that even more. And in that seminar, I've started to find my people, my allies, which is, as a minority, is very important. And also, in a way, it made me really sort of empathize with what the Muslim minority in India probably goes through, or even in the US, because as a minority, you have significantly lesser privileges socially and in the public sphere. The cultural memory discourse at that time was also kind of emerging in India. It was not like an established discourse yet. There definitely wasn't a memorial to the partition in India for the longest time. This has only started happening in the last 5 years, with the Partition Museum being the first one, being the Partition Museum. In my mind, that's the first actual memorial to the partition. So yes, it did start in university. That's right. to give you a long answer.
No, I mean, I think it's interesting that you also talk about your experience of being somewhat racialized minority in the States, and the idea that universal, of course, is equated with white narratives. And then in response to this erasure or marginalization, there's often an essentializing of diaspora identity that serves, their dominant groups. I mean, even within the States, for example, when people think of Indian culture, they actually are thinking of upper caste Hindu culture. They're not actually, their whole idea of being an Indian Muslim or a Dalit Indian is not something that troubles this construction of who is an Indian, even in the States, even in the diaspora. So I think it's really interesting that that these experiences kind of also in some way influence your own approach to the art that you were making, and to sort of go back to even this idea, what you mentioned earlier about reading about the Holocaust or the Shoah, as it's also called, how that kind of that engaging with that discourse and the visual art or the representations that were coming out of that, those conversations, how that influenced your own practice. Even the very idea of the anti-memorial or the counter-monument, for example, that you invoke in discussing your work. Now, these are ideas that the scholar James E. Young uses in relation to German artists' attempts to come to terms with the Holocaust in the 80s and 90s. Now, one of his claims is that due to the fact that the German state was the violator rather than the victor, and the way that the Nazis used monumentality as a way to sort of legitimize their ideology, these generations that came after were turning to mediums and modes of commemoration that were the opposite of those used in traditional monument building, of nation states looking to glorify themselves. So I'm wondering, like, how that particular formulation, how you sort of adopted that, worked through it, and then kind of how that probably informed your own choice of materials and techniques.
Yes, for sure. So the people, the group, the demographic that causes the most grief for Muslim minorities, that's the demographic I belong to. So what you're talking about in Germany, where people of the post-Shoah generations, the artists from post-Shoah generation, are making these anti-memorials as a way to express maybe remorse, or maybe to very deliberately and intentionally counter what their the generation before them had done. I do feel a certain level of this collective guilt of upper caste Hindus. What our demographic has sort of perpetrated on the Muslims in India, and so therefore, I think that's one of the reasons, perhaps, why I gravitate towards the form of the anti-memorial or the counter-monument, because monumentality is not going to be able to express what I wish to express. I mean, I wish to express remorse. I wish to make gestures of repair. I mean, I deeply feel like, that the Muslim population in India has been very deeply wronged, and I do very much, I don't know, try to make amends through the artwork, which feels really not enough.
Because really, it's definitely a complicated process.
A complicated emotion, but I feel like the amends that would actually make a difference need to be done politically. In the civil sphere, in the public sphere, in the governmental sphere. But because I am not in those spheres, I try to do it through my artwork, because I feel like that's the instrument I can wield. Perhaps that maybe that's what I would need to make peace with. That's what I can do. Is acknowledgement. Is that I hear you, I see you, I understand what you've been put through.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's not only a complicated emotion to work through, but also, I mean, one wonders, if one isn't, then, I mean, I think about this all the time with all of the work that any of us do with the best intentions, that if we aren't merely like becoming further implicated in, in a politics of guilt, because it's also a form of sort of absolving oneself, right, from one's proximity to these acts. And in fact, like this is true around the world, right? There's a certain way in which this can veer into an aestheticization of, as you said, like material asymmetries and harms, right? The fact that there are actually, at least in this country currently, Muslims being massacred or threatened with genocide, you do wonder like how that suffering can be in any way, responded to adequately, because that's also one of the challenges of representing historical trauma. To go back to the partition, which is a kind of epochal moment of extreme violence. In that, how do you represent something like that? And there is an entire body of scholarship and literature just tackling this question: is it even possible to depict violence of this scale and nature? And so I also wondered, like, to take a cue from what you're talking about, just in terms of material strategy, artistic strategy, like I'm thinking of a work like Remembering the Crooked Line, right? Where you've used, blouses, cholis, you've used kites, you've used board games, traditional South Asian board games, as forms through which you communicate the concept of territorial division in many countries. So what made you select these objects, and what is the value in linking these differing partitions to each other?
Yes, great question. Thank you. So materially, obviously, because I'm working in the ambit of an anti-memorial or a counter-monument, I choose fragile materials. I choose materials that are inherently precarious. So I, in Remembering the Crooked Line, I've used, like Khadar cotton and Tussar silk. And, I have stitched map lines on them, and I've also burned map lines on them. And of course, with the the chess and the precisi piece, I print it on them and then I draw on them and stitch on them and do embroidery to highlight the line of division. So, and of course, the intertextual reference here, of course, is the crooked line, Teri Lakir by Weisman Art. Yeah. In which, of course, there is the Muslim woman protagonist, right, in India, coming of age in the 1940s, eventually gets romantically involved with an Irishman who she initially mistakes for being a white British man. It's just sort of this like brilliant juxtaposition by Chugtai in the 1950s, in creating this tale where the Muslim woman could never be the Mother India, right? She's outside of the canon, but that's the heroine of this huge historical allegorical novel in which she's also making the connections with another British colony, which is Ireland. So that's kind of where it came to me that, Britain had a lot of different colonies, and what happened with the other colonies when when the exited. So that's how I started researching, the Irish partition, and then of course that happened in 1919, right? So that was when the Irish declared their independence. It was also very violent, very bloody, as you know. There are so many parallels to their narrative and our narrative. And then there was, I come to find there was this Indo-Irish League. They were providing.
And there are also these socialist linkages among, between communists in India and communists in Ireland, both in fighting an anti-colonial struggle.
Yes. And then, of course, Palestine. So Palestine was a British mandate, which is basically another word for being a colony. That was partitioned 2 months after our partition, so November of 1947. And you would think that from what they saw, and then you saw what happened in India, right?
Yeah.
2 months after that, you are in Palestine and you are exiting from Palestine and you partition there.
Right.
And both parties rejected, and you leave, knowing that this is going to be another, decades-long conflict. Understanding these, just the sort of, if you just look at these three partitions, right, Ireland and Palestine, you kind of get a sense of the politics and the geopolitics involved. And then, of course, I come to find that there's all these other instances in history, just in the 20th century. So there is the colonial partitions and there is the Cold War partitions, right? So you've got in the Cold War partitions, you've got Germany and Korea and Vietnam. And then in the colonial partitions, you've got India, Ireland, and Palestine. And then sort of these like neo-imperial partitions of like Cyprus and Bosnia. And just when you start to look at, so there's that one lens where you're only looking at the one history and the one partition. But then when you look at it as one of many, when you look at it as from a multi lens, right?
Right.
Then you find other threads. You find other threads of geopolitics that may elude one if one were only looking at it from, the point of view of this is one partition that I am looking at. So Chuktai's book kind of led me into that, and so therefore I titled it after her book, Remembering the Crooked Line. But to come back to your original question of materials, the materials are very carefully sort of picked. So I'm using pig guts on the kites. I'm using surgical sutures, as a gesture of repair on the cholis and the kites. I'm sort of burning the partition line. And so I'm trying to materially manifest this idea of a rupture, and then my attempts, maybe futile attempts at repair. So in all this, I'm thinking of skin. like, the materiality of skin, of human bodies. So even though it's this large history, like this macro history of a nation or many nations, I'm still trying to locate it in the bodies of, and in the experience of individuals. So individual bodies, how these events may leave scars on individual bodies, but then also thinking of maps as sort of the skin of the nation, and then the skin gets ruptured where this line of division is then made. So I'm burning it in, I'm ripping it, so there's this sort of violence to the material itself. But then I'm also going back and making a gesture of repair by stitching it, or using surgical sutures, whatnot. So pig guts is sort of like an interesting material to work with, because when it's wet, it's very smelly.
Right.
And as a vegetarian, it makes me crazy. But it's so that. But then I also color it using turmeric, and all of this stuff. So I use tea and turmeric with all these materials, which are sort of the original items of colonial trade, so to speak. Spices and tea and cotton and silk. These type of, like, this is what initially colonial trade was sort of built on, even with the East India Company. But then I use these other materials to create the skin-like texture, and use wax, and I use lighting to make the objects translucent, sort of.
Right.
So to create the sort of otherworldly, ghostly feeling of bodies that are present but absent. Right? So you only see the cholis and the kurtis, you only see the form, but they are hollow. The rest of the body is not present. The kites just sort of hang there, but I sort of usually install them in a line. So they're installed from the ceiling, but they're creating a line, much like a Radcliffe line, And then of course, with the chess and the precisi, I'm using silk, and and I actually set up a board. I set up a chess board. I set up a precisi board, and I've had people actually sit down and play a game of chess and play a game of precisi using my weird setup, in a way, because it's the precisi panels have maps of all these different countries that have been partitioned. So and that's a big history to kind of express through materials. So that's what brings me to these kind of materials of these sort of precarious, fragile, frail materials that can convey the reality of skin.
Right. No, I was also curious because I wondered, like, what which traditions in art, you might be placing your work in a particular lineage of art practice. I mean, using materials like this, there's a whole legacy of post-minimalist, especially women artists, doing this, using material in this particular way, and unorthodox kinds of materials, and that they manipulate in very expressive and provocative ways. So I was wondering if that's also something that you were kind of, maybe subconsciously or consciously, connecting your own practice to.
So the post-minimalist memory sculptures, that's the lineage that I would put my work in. And funnily, of course, that has also been theorized a lot by Andreas Huyssen, in present past. And of course, he talks about Doris Salcedo's works, which, I mean, I love her works. I love Doris Salcedo's use of material, there is the Arthur Biliaro's work where...
Right. I was going to ask you about that, yeah. And especially in relation to Silent Waters, where you're using feet. So I wanted to...
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And of course, the way she uses pig guts and surgical sutures too. And she's sort of almost embedding these found shoes into the wall and then sealing them with pig guts and surgical sutures. And I mean, it's another Holocaust motif, where, you remember the photos of the piles of shoes of, the people that were gassed in the chambers, and, the piles of hair and the piles of coats, and, just this, they were reduced to this inanimate things that the shoes were saved, the coats were saved, even, but the people were killed. People were gassed, and of course, Doris Salcido's context of Colombia, where, again, state-sponsored violence, where opponents of the government, these young people were just disappeared in mass, quite possibly tortured and then killed, and then maybe or maybe not later found in mass graves, So I think this lineage of post-minimalist memory sculptures is definitely where I would place my work into, very, very squarely in that tradition, or in that practice, really, of creating artworks of resistance, artworks that memorialize, that acknowledge, but then also resist, sort of hegemonic narratives of events. So in India, the narrative, of course, is the independence of India, the hero narrative of India and India's freedom fighters. We fought bravely and we got independence from the British. And in this narrative, the nation of India always emerges as the hero, right? And in this narrative, there is really no place to even acknowledge the violence of partition, other than this very narrow narrative of victim, where India was, Hindus were the victims of partition violence, and Muslims were the aggressors, and so that's the only way that it can be acknowledged. One almost has to kind of harness these kind of abject materials, hair and skin, to highlight or to express this other narrative, the narrative that's outside of those nationalist hero narratives.
Right. And, as we've been discussing through this conversation at various points by citing scholars who've done this, like the feminist historiography that's come to bear on partition studies in the past 20 or 30 years is sort of premised on countering this hegemonic narrative. So just to sort of go back to Salcido's work, and I was just looking at some of her pieces and also comparing them to your work, and there's this kind of interesting dialectic between visible and invisible that her work definitely is suggestive of. And I see that, for example, in your work, in the case of very clearly, I mean, in the case of Remembering the Crooked Line, where the blouses really made me think of the bodies of women that are both there and not there. So this idea of absence that you mentioned, also because we know how the bodies of women, their surfaces, their skins were violated, inscribed by the men of the other communities. So this idea of the visible and the invisible is really intriguing, and it sort of comes through in your choice of materials as well. And I was also thinking, in the case of Salcido's work, like the abducted figure is at the heart of her practice as well, right? I mean, it's a completely different socio-historical and political setting in which she's working, or to which she's responding. But this idea of the missing person, right? Whether it's a man or a woman or anyone, a citizen that's missing, basically, right? So that's really interesting. Also, how you deal with absence and negation. And then, what happens is that then in a sort of in an aesthetic kind of response to something like this, to events like this, it's almost like the trace or the index becomes the mode through which you represent, right? Because you can't represent frontally. You can never know the entirety or totality of the trauma. So it's through indexes, through objects, through traces, And they almost
Yes.
they almost rhyme with the scar and the wound, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. That's definitely what is going on with the objects I try to make, is to uh, is to create that trace, or to create that index of the the trauma that has been perpetrated on individual bodies. And the I feel that Salcedo's um, works, like especially the Unland, and the Arthur Biliaros, uh, actually, to me, really resonate with Kashmir's current situation. Where young protesters are being, just taken away, no due process really, and then families are finding them in mass graves years later, or not, nothing, or just nothing, unmarked mass graves where you can't even tell. um, I mean, talk about universal, right? This is so, but the idea of traces and memory traces and indexes of creating indexes of events that have historical events that have passed, but now they still impact the present. I mean, this is something that is there in almost all of the works in at least in the Partition Anti-Memorial Project, because, so for example, the memory links, that work with the copper dharapatras and Havan Kunds. In that, I invite viewers to actually pour water through the dharapatras to activate the leakage of the memory that is represented on each dharapatra into the Havan Kund. So I'm literally sort of inviting the viewer to activate that leak, to activate that indexicality of that event. So each Dharapatra is sort of etched with the name and year of a significant communal riot, and by significant, I mean something that obviously, caused a high number of deaths, but also culturally kind of was sort of a landmark event, that probably affected the Muslim minority in India in a significant way. Like, it's another sort of huge reminder of this is how you will be treated in this country.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so. I mean, in terms of I'm so glad you brought up memory leaks, because it's a work that kind of underscores the way in which the partition recurs, the memory of the partition haunts.
Yes.
India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, but I mean, I can speak to India definitely. That the way in which the narratives and the stories and the memories of the partition, post memories, as Marianne Hirsch talks about, of the partition, are kind of constantly reactivated at any moment of crisis, is quite telling. And it will never entirely leave any experience of, the body politic that we can have, it seems, as citizens who belong to different religions, because our entire identity was constituted along religious lines. I mean, even though, for example, India, from the very beginning, characterized itself as a secular country, as a republic, we know that socially that's not quite how it played out, right?
Yes.
So, and because it didn't play out that way socially, the state, which is always going to be sort of, emboldening the majority, it's something that has had repercussions for us, even in terms of our civic life and our political, our legislative life. So I think what's interesting about memory leaks, though, it made me think also, like, you'll be using in this particular work, like, you use objects almost like as metonyms, right, as stand-ins for communities. And so there's always this danger that this might become an oversimplification. And so as an artist, that's something I guess that you have to guard against or think about, right? How do you sort of work through this problem?
So that's why I kind of work in the anti-memorial space, because given the materials I use and given the objects I make, it would be very hard for a state actor to appropriate them and say, oh, this is why we do this. This is why we are a victim. This is why Muslims are bad. This is why Pakistan is bad. Because I make it quite clear in the work itself that that my politics are not the state politics. That's not, so my works kind of just materially kind of belie that, like materially just deny the possibility of state appropriation, and that's very much intentional. It's very much intentional.
I guess I meant this in a more abstract sense that there's a danger with sort of associating. Well, not danger, but I mean, I think it's more complicated, which is why I want to understand your process. That, like, for example, Dharapatras and Havans, are associated with Hindu religious practices, and Urdu books aren't really. I mean, now they become a target for Hindutva government, but Urdu, for example, it was the language of North Indian. Educated North Indians for the longest time. So that, I think, is, to me, this is worry of sort of identitarian essentialism, or sort of an ease with which we can, we might kind of reduce complex events or dynamics. And I think that's something one struggles with, right, in art making, because you're fundamentally working with objects.
Yeah. So I will tell you a story about this. So, I made the Memory Leaks project in the Sanskriti Foundation. It was as part of a residency. And so, every other day I was going to Old Delhi to find the Dharapatras and the Havan Kunds, because you can't really find them in a mall, for example, right? So when I got there, I made several trips, and then I found some dealers that, could from where I could source the Dharapatras and Havan Kunds, and then but I needed more. I needed in more sizes than what they had in the shop at that time. So they said, okay, we'll deliver it to you. Where are you? So I gave them the address of Sanskriti Foundation. I said, it's this organization. You come and ask for me, and they'll either send you to where I am, or I'll come to the reception and I'll pick them up. So at this time, I'm into it. I've done the etchings on several of the Dharapatras already of the communal rights. And the office brought them to my studio, my live work studio, to deliver the Dharapatras. So these two gentlemen walk in, and they initially they are, I could see that they are very, sort of delighted to be in this Hindu organization, Sanskriti Foundation and all this. And then they came in to the studio, and they were very curious about what I'm doing with them. Like, why do I need so many Dharapatras, right? So, and they picked up a couple, and they looked at it, and then they sort of realized what I'm doing, Damn,
it's not a yagya. Oops.
Yeah. And so if they started asking me questions like, so why are you making this work, and they quickly became very upset. They're like, you're making India look bad. You're making Indians look bad. Like, I mean, it became like a fight. But it also, to me, it brought home the point that, if I were to just put a Dharapatra and a Havan Kund, yes, that is open to being, co-opted. But because I have etched the body of each Dharapatra with those holy marks, and very prominently with the year and name of the communal riot. And of course, I'm using the Dharapatra very intentionally. And my representation is tame from that perspective, because I'm putting Urdu books, like decidedly Urdu books, meaning Urdu meaning written in the Arabic script, right? They are partially burnt. They are present in the Havan Kund. So the water that I'm asking the viewers to pour through the Dharapatra is dripping drop by drop into the Havan Kund. So in a way to sort of symbolically to put out our sun. So I think, even though I very intentionally use these religious objects, right? My my dream is for some of these RSS people to actually visit this installation and pour the water as a gesture of remorse for what they have.
You mean a reformed RSS, of course?
Yeah, they are reformed RSS.
Yeah, because that's the only way. I understand, like, there's a kind of therapeutic aspect to some of this, which is interesting. Like, that because you're inviting participation.
Yes.
And so it takes on a different kind of charge because you're sort of involving the bodies of the spectators and visitors.
Yes.
Doing
Indeed.
it.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also curious, like, I mean, I actually, on a final note, did want to, discuss with you about the Partition Museum and even the 1947 Partition Archive. Scholars like, for example, Ravinder Kaur, who's a scholar of the Partition, she wrote a great piece, I think in The Wire, about this. Her critique was basically that there's a way in which there's this depoliticization of the partition that happens with these kinds of organizations or initiatives, where the foregrounding of individual narratives is at the cost of structural critique of the state. So you can very easily kind of, efface the complicity of societies and communities in raping and butchering each other by using something like the formulation of the idea of the human subject. That's what she talks about. Like, I'm just going to quote her. She has this line where she says, the human subject in this project is a free-floating agent disconnected from the realm of politics, rather than kind of, these projects inviting examination into how these events happened and the political and social kind of infrastructure and sort of machinery of legitimization that allowed these large-scale acts of violence to happen in the first place.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's interesting. And like somebody else, I think I'm forgetting who. There was this piece where he talked about fridge magnets carrying the Partition Museum logo at the Jaipur Literary Festival. Hang on, let me look it up. I think the gentleman is Tarun K. Saint. He's an independent scholar, I mean, I just thought it was really funny because he kind of brought it up in the context of like the people sort of abusing certain concepts, like in this case, Pierre and Ora's concept of the lieu de mémoire. So you basically make it a fridge magnet. That's not a lieu de mémoire. I'm sorry.
No.
So like the way in which these in capitalism and a certain kind of easy liberal humanism can just do away with the messy business of wash its hands of the messy business of our own dysfunctions as societies.
You bring up an important point about the 1947 Partition Archive too. I mean, I really kind of appreciate, Gunjan Bhalla's initiative. Gunit Bhalla's. I'm sorry, Gunit Bhalla's. Initiative. I'm so sorry, Gunita Bhalla's initiative of collecting individual testimonies. But I mean, as important as that is, I mean, it is important to collect those testimonies, but I do see how it kind of defangs the overall critique of, of the communalism that has emerged out of the partition riots. I mean, and she has been sort of good about sort of training people on both sides of the border, as citizen historians and whatnot, citizen archivists. And all of that is appreciable. But I think it does open itself up to this situation where it becomes like a feel-good thing, where people can walk away.
Sort of removing the object of inquiry from the field, both discursive and material, in which it operates actually, right?
Yes, and sort of, I mean, it does transform it into this arena of like easy liberal humanism, where so because we have acknowledged and recorded the testimony and we have honored it in a certain way, so we're good,
exactly, that self-absolution thing.
Self-absolution thing, which I think is not. It's not, because it's still continuing. I mean, it would be another thing if we were in a moment in history in South Asia where communal tensions had been resolved. that a communal conflict had been resolved, it was no longer happening. I think then it would be kind of okay, because then it's just a matter of like emotionally and psychologically getting past the historical trauma. But this is a very present thing. And that's the whole point of my Partition Anti-Memorial Project. It's a very present thing. This is not over. This is not just a history lesson. We live in it. So it's not over. And so, yes, I mean, just taking testimony from partition survivors then kind of minimizes how it's actually still haunting and present in contemporary politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. That's it. Also, I wanted to ask you, do you want to tell our listeners about your show?
Yes. Yes. So on that note, so for the first time, I'm getting to show all these like 10 projects from the Partition Anti-Memorial Project in one place, in one venue. And that is the South Asia Institute in Chicago. And it opens on August 6th and runs till December 10th.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's a good few months. I hope
it's a good couple of months, right?
Like kind of find the time to come and visit and see the work.
Yeah, but on the 75th anniversary of the partition, I think this is significant to kind of be able to stage a large scale anti-memorial to the partition, and again, not to take away the troubling aspects of it, because it's a present trauma. It's not a past trauma. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time, Pritika. I really appreciate you coming onto Artalaap and talking to us about your work.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was such a wonderful and generative conversation. Thank you.
I feel the same way.
I'm so honored. I'm so honored to be on Artalaap.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for tuning into Artalaap with Pritika Chowdhry as we discussed her series on the partition in the context of counter-memory, internationalist solidarity, and feminist history writing. You can check out her show, Unbearable Memories, Unspeakable Histories, at Chicago's South Asia Institute till the 10th of December. You can get updates and information about the show on their Instagram page at South Asia Institute. We want to keep bringing you unique content, so please consider supporting us on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. We have exclusive features for subscribers at different tiers. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alaap and on Twitter at @RTALAAP.